"Can I keep what's left, sir?" But when he looked into her eyes, everything changed. Tell us where you're watching from, leave a like, and don't forget to subscribe. Enjoy the story. Leah walked through the narrow, damp streets of Capitol Hill in Seattle with one single goal: to find something to eat before the afternoon came to an end. The little girl in her arms, curled tightly against her chest, slept soundly, unaware of the cold slipping through the thin collar of her mother's shirt. It was late autumn, and the biting wind stung her face. Leah knew these streets well and understood that if she waited for the bigger food banks, it might already be too late. She passed by a bakery window but didn't have the courage to go in. Then she stopped in front of a busy cafe where steaming plates still rested on outdoor tables. There were men in jackets and women dressed sharply. One of them, sitting alone, seemed distracted by his phone. Leah took a deep breath, stepped forward carefully, and quietly asked if she could have whatever was left on his plate. The man looked up surprised, then glanced at the baby in her arms. He didn't say anything. He simply called the waiter and asked for a hot meal to go and a bottle of water. She didn't know how to react. She stood still as the order was packed. The man, who later introduced himself as Richard, asked if she had somewhere to sleep. Leah replied with a vague gesture. She didn't trust strangers, but she also didn't sense any threat in his eyes. When the bag was handed over, he extended it toward her without touching her. He said he wouldn't ask any questions, but if she wanted to sit nearby, she could. Leah thanked him softly and walked across the small plaza in front of the cafe, until she found a wooden bench under a tree. She sat down gently, settled the baby on her lap, and opened the container. The smell of freshly prepared food filled the air. She set a portion aside for later and ate the rest. Her hands trembled as she lifted the fork to her mouth. She felt out of place, as if that simple act of kindness belonged to a world far from hers. Later, after sitting there for quite some time and finishing the last bites, Richard came back. He was holding another bag, this time with a small bottle of ready-to-feed formula, some fruit, and a baby shirt with the tag still on. Leah touched the items with disbelief, as if she wasn't sure they were real. The bag was plain, but the contents had clearly been chosen with care. She packed everything into the worn backpack she carried and spent the rest of the afternoon looking for a place to rest. She avoided larger shelters, wandering through side streets until she found a narrow space behind a public library. Next to a row of donation bins, she spread out a blanket on the concrete and laid down with her daughter wrapped in her arms. There was no comfort, but there was some safety, and that day, that was more than she expected to have. The night brought noise and cold. Leah slept in short stretches, her body alert at all times. When the sky started to lighten, she packed everything quickly, wrapped the baby snugly in the blanket, and headed toward a place where bread was sometimes handed out. She received a piece, ate half, and used the rest to feed her daughter. There was no warm milk, but it was food. She sat on the concrete steps outside an old side entrance of a community center and watched the street wake up. Her mind returned to Richard, to the unexpected gesture, the lack of questions. Most people wanted a backstory before offering anything. He didn't. He simply saw her, and somehow that stayed with her. That morning, with nowhere else to go, Leah returned to the plaza outside the cafe. She sat on the same wooden bench, the baby once again asleep against her chest. She spent some time watching the people, the cars, the thick grey sky above, and when she saw Richard approaching with 2 cups in his hands, her body stiffened on instinct. But there was no reason to fear. He simply sat beside her, held out one of the cups and said, "Good morning. I didn't bring questions, just coffee." Leah took the cup with one hand, feeling the warmth seep into her fingers. She looked at him for a few seconds, unsure of what to say. Then, almost involuntarily, she smiled. Small, subtle, but genuine. Richard didn't try to make conversation. They sat there for a while in silence, just sharing the warmth of the drink and each other's company. When he finally stood up, he told her he'd be around if she needed anything. He didn't insist. He didn't offer a phone number or make any promises. He just walked down the sidewalk as if he understood that pushing too hard would only push her away. Leah watched until he disappeared between the buildings. The coffee still warm in her hands, the baby asleep on her chest, and a strange feeling that something had shifted. She didn't know what it was, but for the first time in a long time, she didn't feel entirely invisible. Leah didn't return to the plaza the next day. She had barely slept. The baby had been more restless than usual, and she'd spent the entire morning trying to find a tube of diaper rash cream, with no luck. She was walking near a small grocery store when she saw him again across the street. The same man from the cafe, Richard. He was standing near a flower stand, a grocery bag in hand. Leah thought about turning away, but he spotted her first and crossed over, calling her name gently, as if careful not to startle her. She stopped. She didn't run, but she didn't smile either. He simply said, "I've got something for you too." He held out the bag, ready to feed formula, a few jars of mashed fruit, a small pack of diapers, and a thick wool scarf. Leah took the items with both hands and nodded silently in thanks. Richard didn't ask anything. He just said if she needed anything, he worked nearby, and pointed to a beige storefront down the block. She thanked him and returned to the back area of the public library where she'd been setting up her makeshift shelter whenever possible. She fed her daughter slowly, wrapped her tighter in the blanket, and let her eyes wander toward the overcast sky. She thought about his words, about the gesture, and about her own silence. She had never asked for closeness, never expected someone to come back after a single act of kindness. But he had returned, and now she knew where to find him. Over the next few days, she avoided the plaza, not because she feared him, but because she didn't know what to do with the offer of presents. She was used to anonymous giving, distant hands. A name, a face, and consistency broke the pattern of survival. It confused her, and confusion was a luxury she couldn't afford. 3 days later, on a clearer afternoon, Leah showed up again at the bench. Debbie was doing better. She slept peacefully, nestled in the sling against her mother's chest. Leah held a bottle of water and stared across the street. Richard approached with his usual calm stride and sat down without saying anything. He pulled out 2 slices of cake wrapped in wax paper. He offered her one, which she accepted with a quiet gesture. They ate in silence. The sugar felt out of place in her routine, too sweet for an ordinary day, but she ate it all. Richard mentioned he'd seen an opening at a nearby shelter that offered private rooms for mothers with babies. He said he wouldn't push, but could get her the address if she was interested. She bit her lower lip, uncertain. She didn't reject the idea, just said she'd have to think about it. Shelters made her nervous. He understood, said he'd be around through the weekend if she changed her mind. When he left, Leah stayed. It was like the time spent with him had paused the rest of the world. When she finally stood up, everything felt faster again. The baby still slept. The cold was creeping in, and she needed to find dinner. But a part of her had remained on that bench, the part that didn't yet know how to respond to someone who looked at her without pity or urgency. The next morning, Leah went, looking for the place Richard had said he worked. She found it easily, a modest cafe with pale wooden counters and potted plants in the windows. She asked for him and waited outside. Richard came out smiling, hands in the pockets of his apron, and asked if she wanted to come in. She declined, just needed the address. He handed her a small piece of paper, didn't ask anything else. Leah tucked the note into her pocket and thanked him with a rough voice. She walked away slowly. That afternoon, she went to the address he'd given her. It was a simple building but clean, with an iron gate and a warm front desk. She filled out a form, answered a few questions, and was given the key to a small room with a crib, a bed, and a heater. When she closed the door behind her, alone with her daughter, Leah leaned her back against the wall and slid down to the floor. For the first time in a long while, she wasn't outside. There were no plastic bags on the ground, no noise from the street, no fear of being chased away. She picked up her daughter, fed her the formula that was left, and then tucked her under a blanket on the bed. She lay down beside her, eyes fixed on the dim ceiling light. It felt strange, like she was living something that didn't belong to her. But it did. And deep down, she knew part of it came from that man who had never asked for anything in return. Leah woke up early, even though she hadn't slept well. The room at the shelter was simple but warm and quiet. Her daughter was still sleeping in the crib, breathing a little more peacefully than before. For the first time in weeks, Leah felt her body slightly less tense. She got up carefully, washed her face in the bathroom sink next door, and checked the pockets of her jacket for the rest of the formula Richard had given her. There was still half a bottle left. She fed Debbie, adjusted her clothes, and wrapped her snugly in the dark blue blanket. Then she ate one of the cookies she had saved from the last food bag. It wasn't much, but it was enough to get her through the morning. When she stepped outside, the sky was still grey, and the traffic on the avenue had begun to pick up. She decided to walk toward the cafe, not because she needed anything. She just wanted to see with her own eyes whether he was still there. He was. Richard was out front, wearing a dark apron tied around his waist, wiping down one of the sidewalk tables when he saw her. He smiled casually, like seeing an old acquaintance. Leah approached slowly. She didn't know what to say, so she simply leaned against the metal railing near the window. He asked how the little one was doing. She said better. Richard offered her a coffee, which she declined with a slight shake of her head. She said she had only come to say thank you. He told her she didn't have to thank him, but even so, his face lit up when she spoke. He added that the street didn't feel as cold that day. Leah looked around, the heavy coats, the shoes soaked from puddles in the asphalt. They stood there for a few minutes until Richard asked if she had any plans for the day. She said no, so he pointed toward a small nearby park. I usually pass through there before heading home. There's a bench by the trees. It's quiet. Leah didn't answer right away, but later that afternoon they ended up walking in that direction. Together, they reached the park through a side street. It wasn't crowded, just a few babies in strollers and elderly people walking slowly. Richard pointed out one of the more secluded benches and sat down. Leah stood for a moment, then sat too. Her daughter was still asleep, bundled up close to her chest. Richard opened a paper bag he'd brought and pulled out 2 warm hand pies. He offered one to her. Leah accepted it with both hands, as if it were something precious. They ate slowly. He didn't ask about her past. He didn't mention family or why she was there. He only said that sometimes people crossed paths for reasons only time could explain. Leah looked at him without responding. But something in that phrase settled inside her. She shifted slightly on the bench and took a deep breath. Fear still lived in her, but it wasn't the only feeling anymore. As the afternoon faded and they parted ways, Richard mentioned that he had an early bread delivery the next morning and might not make it to the park. Leah nodded. That was fine. She thanked him for the food, the company, and for not trying to force a connection. She walked back to the shelter more slowly than usual, carrying her daughter in her arms, but also carrying a new thought. Someone in this city knew her name. And even without making promises, he showed her care. When she got to the room, she gave Debbie a bath using warm water from the sink, put on a clean diaper, and heated the rest of the formula near the space heater. She watched her daughter settle into the narrow mattress, then turned off the light. Lying on her side, facing the wall, she could still hear voices from the street through the cracked window, but they no longer felt as threatening. The next morning, Leah was the one who showed up first. She passed by the cafe and left a small bundle, an apple and 2 cookies wrapped in a napkin. She handed it to the woman at the counter and asked her to give it to Richard. Then she walked to the park. She sat on the same bench, and she waited. Richard didn't come. The bread delivery was real, but Leah didn't feel alone. She stayed for almost an hour. She saw the same faces passing, the same leaves falling. When she stood up to leave, it felt like that bench was no longer just a place to stop. It had become a place to wait. The next day, he was there again, and so was she. The following weeks fell into a rhythm, occasional meetings, the same park bench, small exchanges that slowly grew in meaning. Richard brought her a new blanket on a windy day. Leah shared a pack of crackers she had received from a donation center. Neither of them spoke of friendship, help, or charity. It was as if they simply existed for each other in that little corner of the city, without naming what they were building. But the bond was there, growing, and eventually Leah started to believe that maybe it was possible to walk beside someone, not out of need, not out of desperation, but because she chose to. The morning was grey, with low clouds hanging over the rooftops of Capitol Hill like a soft ceiling. Leah stepped out of the shelter with her daughter tucked snugly in the sling across her chest, a blanket wrapped around the baby's body, her cheeks already rosy from the contrast between the warm inside and the chilly street air. She had slept a bit better, with fewer startles, and the simple fact of waking up in a room with walls, a bed, and a heater still felt like a recent privilege. She stopped by the local farmer's market, hoping to trade some donated fruit for a few fresh vegetables, then made her way toward the park. It was a walk that had taken on meaning in recent weeks. The small plaza where she used to sit just to rest had become something else entirely, a place of connection, a corner of the city that felt like it belonged to them. And Richard, always steady, always watchful, was already waiting. She didn't say anything as she approached. She just sat next to him on their usual bench while adjusting Debbie in her lap. Richard handed her a small paper box containing 2 slices of savory pie. Leah accepted. They ate slowly, with no need to fill the air with words. After a while, he mentioned that he had taken 2 days off from the cafe and was planning to visit an old bookstore he used to frequent in another part of town. He said he had thought about inviting her if she felt like going. Leah turned her head toward him, surprised. It wasn't a formal invitation, no elaborate plans, just a simple offer, spoken casually. She gave a small nod. Sure. Richard smiled softly, and that was all. They walked side by side through narrow streets, the damp gravel crunching underfoot, the cold wind winding between the buildings. Richard pointed out small details along the way. A windowsill still filled with flowers despite the season, a cat curled up in the same corner of the sidewalk as always. Leah stayed quiet, but listened. When they arrived at the bookstore, they went in together. The place was warm, with the smell of old pages and the soft sound of jazz playing from a vintage record player in the back. Debbie was still asleep, lulled by the steady rhythm of the walk. Richard greeted the shop owner, pulled 2 books from a low shelf, and sat with her on one of the worn-out couches near the back wall. Leah took in everything slowly, like someone exploring a world she'd never belonged to, but was beginning to approach, carefully. She picked up one of the books and flipped through it gently, not really reading, just letting herself touch the pages, feel their weight, look at the covers. Richard asked if she liked to read. Leah said that before she was pregnant, she used to volunteer at a community library, reading stories to children. He listened without interrupting. And for the first time, she said her daughter's name out loud. Her name is Debbie. Richard repeated it under his breath. Debbie, as if holding on to it quietly. After that, they didn't need to speak anymore. They remained there for nearly an hour, simply sharing the warmth, the space, the time. When they finally left, the sky was already darkening. Richard offered to walk her back to the shelter. She declined politely, saying he didn't need to go out of his way. He didn't push, but before they parted, he pulled a card from his pocket with a number written by hand, in case you change your mind or need anything. Leah took the card carefully, not saying anything right away. She slipped it into the inside pocket of her jacket and thanked him. Then she continued down the sidewalk with steady steps, her daughter still resting close against her body. Back in the shelter room, she hung her coat, laid Debbie down in the crib, and sat on the edge of the bed. The card was still in her pocket. She took it out, looked at it for a moment, then placed it on top of the dresser. She didn't know if she would call, but knowing she could was enough. It was strange to hold a number that meant more than a line on a phone. It was a number that said, you get to choose, and for someone who had lived so long on the margins, that felt almost like a miracle. The stroller wasn't new. The padding on the backrest was already a bit worn down, and the fabric showed clear signs of use. But to Leah, it meant freedom. She received it late in the afternoon, handed over by a staff member at the shelter, who mentioned they had received a recent donation and thought of her because of Debbie's age. It was lightweight, foldable, and despite the wear, it worked perfectly. The next morning, Leah carefully placed her daughter inside, wrapped in 2 blankets with a little blue hat covering her ears. It was the first time in weeks she could walk the streets without carrying her child in her arms. At first, the feeling was strange, like something was missing from her chest. But she soon realized that this small shift brought not just physical relief, but a deeper sense of breath. She left the shelter early, bought a small piece of bread with the few coins she had left, and walked along the sidewalk toward the park where they usually met. Richard was already there, sitting on their usual bench, a book in his lap and a coffee beside him. He looked up as he saw the stroller and, without saying anything, smiled. He asked if she'd like some apple tea, pulling a thermal cup from a paper bag. He also offered 2 buttery cookies, slightly crumbly and dusted with a light layer of sugar. They sat side by side and didn't speak for a while. Dry leaves were scattered across the ground, and the wind rustled the branches overhead with a soft hum. Leah mentioned she had secured a spot for a medical appointment at the local clinic. She didn't go into detail, just noted she might not be around the next day. Richard nodded. Then he mentioned he'd have a busy day too, with a large delivery of specialty breads arriving at the cafe and an early opening. She asked if he liked working there, and for the first time, Richard spoke. A little about himself. He told her he had left a more profitable job because he couldn't handle the constant pressure anymore, the grind, the feeling that nothing really mattered. He wanted something simpler, something human. She listened in silence, without judgment. That evening, as she walked back through the narrow streets between the park and the shelter, pushing the stroller, Leah felt lighter. Debbie slept peacefully, rocked by the steady motion, and Leah was beginning to get used to the idea of having a place to return to. One of the shelter staff mentioned that there might be some workshops for single mothers coming up soon and suggested she sign up. Leah said she'd think about it. She didn't want to commit, but hearing that kind of possibility, without feeling panic, was already progress. Later that evening, she grabbed a clean change of clothes and headed to the shared bathroom down the hall. The space was communal, but it had private stalls with locks, small shared tubs, and a setup for heating water. She chose the stall furthest from the door, locked it quietly, and began preparing everything. She filled the tub with warm water and tested the temperature with the back of her hand. Debbie, calm in her arms, looked around with wide, curious eyes. The bath was gentle, almost a moment of reconnection between them. The warmth washed away more than just dirt. It softened some of the weight. Leah washed herself afterward, quickly, changing clothes. She dressed Debbie in the softest shirt they had and returned to their room, both of them clean, warm, and a little more at peace. The room felt cozier that night. The bed made, the crib ready. Leah spread a blanket across the mattress, sat down with her daughter, and let her move around a bit between the pillows. They played in silence, with small, simple gestures. Debbie grabbing her mother's nose, laughing at silly sounds, pulling at her own toes. It was time they hadn't had before, and Leah allowed herself to smile. Then she prepared a bottle of the formula she'd saved and fed her slowly, holding her close to her chest. When the baby's eyes began to close, she laid her gently in the crib and stayed there for a few minutes, watching her sleep. Only then did she rise, turn off the light, and lie down on the bed. Her eyes stared at the ceiling, her thoughts scattered. Richard, his words about changing his life, her own. Fatigue. She wanted more than to survive, but she didn't yet know what that meant. What she did know was that his presence made the hours feel less heavy. 2 days later, she returned to the park. Richard wasn't there. She waited a few minutes, took a slow walk around, and was about to leave when one of the cafe staff approached her with a small note, folded in 4. "Went to visit my sister. I'll be back tomorrow. Hope to see you." The handwriting was steady, with no flourishes, and it was signed with something she hadn't seen before. Richard D. She tucked the note into her bag and kept walking. More slowly now. She sat on their bench, fed her daughter, and watched the people go by. A group of kids ran past, and one of them tripped near the stroller, quickly getting up and continuing on as if nothing had happened. Leah smiled faintly. There was noise, there was movement, and somehow she didn't feel like she was outside of it anymore. It was as if she was slowly becoming part of the city again. When Richard returned the next day, he brought a small box of sweet bread rolls and mentioned, laughing, that his sister sent her regards. It was the first time he mentioned anyone from his family. Leah wanted to ask more, but held back. Instead, she told him she'd seen a flyer for a short course in kitchen assistance. She wasn't sure if she could attend with a small child, but she said she wanted to try. Richard listened closely and said he knew someone who worked in the program. Maybe they could help her find better hours so Debbie could stay in the community daycare. The conversation flowed more easily now. The exchanges between them no longer needed long pauses or careful wording. And when they said goodbye that day, he briefly touched the sleeve of her coat, not holding on, just touching. Still, Leah walked away, feeling warmth in that arm, as if something new was beginning, even if she didn't have a name for it yet. That night, Leah had trouble falling asleep. The light touch on her coat sleeve stayed with her, as if it had been a much bigger gesture than it seemed. His hand hadn't held on, hadn't insisted, just touched. And yet, the warmth from it had traveled up her arm long after they parted ways. As she lay down, she stared at the ceiling for long minutes. Debbie slept peacefully in the crib, calmed by the rhythm of a routine that was slowly becoming more stable. Leah, who in the early days couldn't even picture tomorrow, now found herself organizing time in her head with almost mathematical precision. Her class would start in 2 days, 3 mornings a week. She had already spoken with one of the shelter staff about the possibility of leaving Debbie at the community daycare during those hours. The answer had been a simple, "We'll try," and that was enough. The next morning, she went to the community center and confirmed her enrollment. She walked back slowly, carrying the feeling that, for the first time in a long while, something was moving. Not pushed by desperation, but moving on its own. The first day of the course was simple. A white uniform, her hair pulled back in a net, clear and practical instructions. Leah listened carefully. Her hands, once used to improvising meals with very little, now learned the names of cuts and the logic behind each step. That night, she mentally repeated everything she'd heard. There were no tests, no grades, but she wanted to get it right. She told Richard about it the next day. He listened with interest, smiling when she described the lesson on vegetables. It was there, on their usual bench, that he mentioned an idea. A woman who worked in the cafe was going to be out for 2 weeks, and the manager was looking for someone to help in the kitchen during that time. Richard said he didn't know if she'd be interested, but he could speak to the manager. Leah said yes, without hesitation. She asked when and what time. He wrote it down on a small slip of paper in that same firm handwriting from before. She showed up 2 days later. Clean clothes, hair tied up, Debbie already dropped off at the daycare inside the shelter. The cafe was on a busy corner, small tables lined along the sidewalk, the smell of fresh bread wafting out onto the street. Richard was waiting at the side door. He showed her the back area, introduced her to the team, explained how things worked. The pace was fast, but not overwhelming. There was a rhythm to it. Leah started out wiping counters, then moved on to helping with simple plate prep, and finally washed a mountain of dishes. In no time, she already knew where everything belonged: the utensils, the baking times, the regular customers with their predictable orders. Richard didn't hover but would appear at the right moments, asking if she was okay, offering her coffee, telling her she could take a break. And during those short pauses, they talked, not about anything deep. About the stubborn oven, the customer who always complained about prices, the new raspberry tea. But Leah felt something solid growing between them, a shared ground taking shape. On the 4th day, she arrived early. She sat on the step by the back door and watched the street. Richard showed up soon after. He didn't say anything, just sat next to her and handed her half an apple. They shared it in silence. The city was just beginning to stir. Early deliveries rolled in on metal carts, and the cafe's back entrance filled with quiet bustle. He asked if she was tired. She said no, but admitted she was still adjusting to the rhythm. When the manager arrived, they got up together and went inside. The day flew by with tasks, but Leah noticed something different about the exhaustion. It wasn't draining, it had weight, but it meant something. That night, back at the shelter, she bathed Debbie, made a bottle, and lay down with a smile. That didn't come from the food or the warm room. It came from somewhere else, something deeper, as if slowly the world was making room for her again. The following week, the manager called her aside for a quick chat. He said he liked her work, that the team had adjusted well with her around, and that if she was open to it, she could stay on for longer. It wouldn't be a permanent contract, but she'd have guaranteed shifts. Leah thanked him and said she'd need to sort out Debbie's daycare schedule, but she wanted to try. When she told Richard, he simply said, "I knew it." There was no smugness, just quiet, steady confidence. That night he walked with her to the entrance of the subway. The streets were nearly empty from the cold. They walked close, slowly. When they reached the top of the stairs, Richard gently touched her arm. "You're doing great." She nodded, unsure what to say. He stepped back. "I'll see you tomorrow." Then he headed down. She stayed there a few seconds longer, feeling the sleeve of her coat where his hand had been. Then she went down too, but with a different heart, not just because of him, because of everything, because of herself, because of her daughter, because the city no longer felt so far away. The next morning, Leah woke up before the communal alarm rang. She gathered a change of clothes for her daughter, packed their essentials into the backpack, and stepped out of the room just as the sunlight began to spill through the slats of the window. The daycare, located inside the shelter itself, had already welcomed Debbie over the past few days, giving Leah the opportunity to establish her new routine. Like before, the little girl would stay until early afternoon. Leah helped settle her. In among the toys, exchanged a few quiet words with the caregiver, and walked out onto the street with steady steps. On class days, She arrived a bit later to the cafe, and every time Richard was there, waiting with an extra apron slung over his shoulder, greeting her with a quick nod and leading her into the rhythm of the day with calm precision. Leah would tie back her hair, slip on the apron, and get to work, usually starting with the front display or prepping ingredients. The space was tight, but well used. Even in the hustle, she felt like she belonged. The hours passed quickly. Between wiping down tables, restocking utensils, and preparing bread baskets for delivery, Leah moved through the cafe with silent focus. Richard, though busy himself, never stopped paying attention. When they crossed paths near the counter, their exchanges were brief, usually about some task or detail, but each word held something extra, something not yet spoken aloud. During their lunch break, they shared a piece of quiche and 2 slices of pie. They sat at the back between sacks of flour and crates of empty jars. It was a makeshift spot, but peaceful. The conversation didn't lead to big declarations, but it revealed how much they aligned. Richard mentioned the cafe owner had noticed Leah's contribution and already considered her part of the team. They went over the next shifts right there. No paper, no schedule apps, just a nod and a quiet agreement. Leah answered with a small smile and a tilt of her head. That was enough. Weeks went by. Her class moved forward with consistency, and work at the cafe became a stable part of her days. The manager, pleased with her performance and attitude, offered her a permanent position with adjusted hours so she could continue attending class and leave Debbie at daycare. That sense of stability opened new doors. Leah began looking for a small studio apartment nearby. The shelter had been essential, but it no longer reflected where she was headed, not because of its limitations, but because now she had the means to move forward on her own. One afternoon after their shift, Richard offered to walk her back to the shelter. They didn't speak much along the way, but walking side by side said enough. When they reached the entrance, he gently touched her shoulder. There was a pause, a flicker of hesitation, then he leaned in and kissed her. It wasn't rushed or hesitant, just sure and steady. She responded, and when they pulled apart, she held his gaze for a few seconds, smiling softly before stepping inside. That night, she fell asleep with the taste of that kiss still on her lips. It had felt simple, but it marked something that no longer needed to be questioned. The next day, everything continued as usual. Cafe, daycare, class. But their glances carried a new weight. What they had wasn't just camaraderie anymore. There was tenderness, trust, and a quiet admiration that grew even among trays, silverware, and pastries. Debbie was adapting beautifully to the daycare, and Leah could breathe more freely, no longer afraid of the next step. Life had found a steadier rhythm. And even without grand plans, she knew one thing with certainty. She wasn't alone anymore. The move to the new studio happened on a mild Saturday morning. Richard arrived early, carrying 2 reusable paper bags, one filled with fresh bread, the other with fruit. He found Leah sorting through a few basic boxes, most of them packed, with Debbie's clothes and modest kitchen items. The small studio she had rented was just a few blocks from the cafe. It was a single open space divided by a standing screen with a recently renovated bathroom. The walls were white, the light wood floor creaked in places, but there was a large window overlooking a small city park and enough space for the baby's stroller and a double mattress pushed up against the wall. When Leah opened the door for him, her face was damp from sweat but calm. She didn't say anything, and neither did he. Richard stepped inside, set the bags down on the small counter, and simply started helping. It took them less than 2 hours to put everything in place. Leah used quick gestures to indicate where things should go, and Richard followed her lead without hesitation. Debbie was asleep in her stroller by the window. When they finished, they sat on the floor and shared a piece of bread with cheese and sliced apples. It was a modest meal, but it meant something. The quiet between them felt easy, as if nothing needed to be explained. Richard looked around and said the place had a good feel. Leah smiled gently. Then, for the first time, she said out loud that she was happy. He didn't respond with words, just reached out and touched her hand, smiling. There was no kiss then, but something deeper had settled between them, a sense of continuity. The days that followed fell into a steady rhythm. Debbie continued going to the shelter's community daycare. Leah's shifts at the cafe remained consistent, and her training course was entering its final stage. Richard's presence gradually became more frequent, never intrusive, just naturally folded into the fabric of her days. On weekends, he often stopped by for a few hours, sometimes helping with lunch, playing with Debbie, or simply being there while Leah tidied up. The way they shared time changed. A shirt left behind, a bag of fresh rolls on the table, a book that ended up on her makeshift shelf. Their connection deepened in those details. Quiet, unannounced. Leah, who used to hold back, began speaking more. She told him about Debbie's father, about the long stretches of fear and absence. Richard listened with his usual calm. Then he shared about his own past, his mother's illness, the months he'd spent living with his sister, and how working at the cafe had become his way of planting roots in Seattle. At the end of the month, Leah received her course certificate. She held it in her hands for a long moment before sliding it into a folder. Outside, Richard was waiting, leaning casually against a street lamp with his hands tucked into his coat pockets. When she stepped out, he broke into a wide smile and pulled her into a long hug. There was no celebration planned, but he brought her to a nearby plaza where a small stand sold hot churros and homemade lemonade. They sat on a stone bench, watching. Debbie toddled around on a blanket spread out on the grass. It was an ordinary day, but there was joy in the quiet. Leah felt like her life was finally forming into something she could call her own. A few more days passed, and one uneventful afternoon, while he was making coffee in the narrow kitchen and she was taking down laundry near the window, Leah walked over slowly, still holding the clothespins in her hand. Richard turned, reaching for them, but before he could say a word, she touched his face and kissed him. It was easy, intimate, certain. When they pulled back, he ran his fingers gently across her cheek and stood there, smiling. What had already been growing between them now lived plainly in the open, no longer just felt, but seen. Autumn settled over the city with gentler temperatures and shorter days. Leah's life had found its rhythm, defined shifts at the cafe, Debbie fully adapted to the community daycare, bills under control, and the little studio beginning to feel like a true home. Richard had become a steady presence, not through any grand gesture, but by showing up consistently. They had lunch together whenever their schedules aligned, shared errands, and gradually began spending weekends as a trio. Debbie had grown fond of him. Her laughter echoed through the room every time the door opened, and she recognized the sound of his key. She'd crawl or toddle quickly to greet him, arms outstretched. Leah watched these scenes unfold with a quiet kind of gratitude, still surprised by the peace that had replaced months of survival. There were no labels between her and Richard, no announcements, but they were together, and they both knew it. That Friday, Leah left the cafe earlier than usual. She had plans to meet an old classmate from her course at a small artisan food fair being held in a nearby street. Richard stayed back with Debbie at the apartment prepping dinner. The fare was lively but relaxed. Stalls with cheeses, breads, preserves, organic produce. Leah was choosing a few items when she heard her name. The voice carried a distinct accent she hadn't heard in months. She turned, and there he was, Debbie's father. Well-dressed, hair neatly styled, an expression somewhere between surprise and satisfaction. He didn't ask how she was. He simply remarked on the coincidence of finding her, claimed he had tried to look for her, said he wanted to see the child. Leah held her grocery bags and stood still, her spine straight. She didn't answer right away. He kept talking, asking Debbie's name, where they lived now, whether Leah was still at the shelter. She listened calmly, but something in her had gone cold. It became clear that he wasn't interested in taking responsibility, only in asserting some right to proximity. He spoke about deserving to meet her, never once mentioning how he might support or protect. Leah finally spoke. She said Debbie was well, that she had a home, food, care, and didn't need anything else. When he pushed further, she asked him politely to back away. Told him he could leave contact information if he wished, but she wouldn't allow sudden involvement without preparation. He bristled, said he was the father, but he didn't push again. He gave a half wave and disappeared into the crowd. She stood there for a moment, her legs unsteady, but she didn't cry. When she got home, it was just past dusk. Richard was sitting on the floor with Debbie in his lap, making up some story about forest animals with exaggerated voices and soft roars. As soon as he saw Leah's face, he noticed the change. She set the bags down and sat beside them, scooping Debbie into her arms. She didn't speak right away, and Richard didn't ask. He waited. She told him slowly who it was, what was said, how it felt. Richard didn't give a speech. He said simply, "You're right. No one shows up after everything and demands to be called a father. He's going to have to earn that." Leah gripped his hand. That was all she needed. In the days that followed, nothing shifted dramatically, but there was a subtle vigilance in her routine. Leah started to pay more attention on the way from the daycare to the cafe. She avoided crowded routes, kept the studio door locked even during the day. She wasn't afraid, but she was alert. Richard offered to accompany her and Debbie more often. He adjusted his schedule to align with daycare pickup times, spent more evenings at the apartment. He became part of the daily structure in a way that was seamless and grounding. Debbie had started calling him something close to Pow. It wasn't Dad, and it wasn't Uncle. It was just Paul, and for that little girl, it was enough. By the end of the month, Leah received news of a new role at the cafe. She would be in charge of maintaining the front display and closing, the dining area on select evenings. When she shared it with Richard, he just smiled and said it made perfect sense. It wasn't a surprise, just a natural outcome. She didn't respond in words. Instead, she stepped closer, rested her cheek on his chest, and stood there for a while. Time was shifting again, and so was she. Winter had started to settle in before the calendar officially turned. Mornings came cloaked in grey, and the air felt drier, heavier on the lungs. Leah replaced the thin sheet on her mattress with a thicker fleece blanket and bought a small, portable heater for the apartment. Wool gloves returned to her bag, and her walk to the cafe was now made with her coat zipped up to the chin. Still, there was something comforting about walking those cold streets, knowing there was a clear destination at the end. Her work felt smooth, natural. Her new responsibility for the cafe's front display brought out an eye for order and presentation she hadn't realized she possessed. Richard often said she had a gift for arranging things, that she turned the counter into an open invitation. Back at the studio, life followed a domestic rhythm. Baskets of clothes to fold, toys scattered around, jars of baby food lined up on the kitchen counter. Debbie was growing strong, her eyes more focused each day, her laughter more frequent. Richard spent most Friday and Saturday nights there. Though he hadn't officially moved in, there wasn't enough room for the three of them. But he was always close. He cooked, changed diapers, did the dishes, not because he had to, but because he genuinely wanted to be part of that life. Leah had started referring to him as part of us in casual conversations at work, like someone who slowly realizes she's no longer on her own, even if neither of them had said it aloud yet. One quiet Sunday afternoon, while cleaning the bookshelves together, Richard mentioned casually that he had found a larger apartment for rent in a nearby neighborhood. He said it wasn't a formal proposal yet, but that he'd been thinking about them moving into a bigger space together. Leah didn't answer right away. She finished wiping down the shelf, then turned and said there was no need to rush, but she liked the idea. That was enough. He smiled, leaned his forehead against hers, and they stayed like that for a moment, no more words needed. With her adjusted schedule at the cafe, her days off were spent on quiet outings. They went to the park, browsed the farmer's market, took Debbie to play in shaded public gardens. They were a small family, not in legal terms or public declarations, but in the way they functioned together. Richard looked after Debbie naturally, and she followed him with her eyes every time he moved across the room. Leah, without needing to make any grand statement, included him in her plans, her meals, her daily thoughts. It was during one of these walks to the park, sitting on a bench, sharing warm paper cups of roasted chestnuts, that Richard spoke up. He said he knew there were still things to work through, past choices, living space, figuring things out, but if she wanted, they could build something more solid together. Leah looked at him quietly for a few seconds, then lowered her gaze. To Debbie, who was sleeping peacefully in his arms, she answered simply, "We already are." And he understood. No declarations were necessary. That same weekend, with no warning and no pressure, Richard took her to a quiet open lot at the edge of the neighborhood. It was lined with tall trees and backed by a small patch of sunflowers. He said he wasn't planning to buy anything right now, but he liked imagining that space as a possibility, a symbol that there could be more beyond the rushed days. Leah squeezed his hand and smiled. She said she didn't know what the future held, but she knew one thing: as long as they were together, there was still a lot to come. In the final scene of that winter, on a blue and chilly evening, Leah finished locking the cafe's front doors, wrapped tightly in a red scarf. Across the street, Richard waited with Debbie in his arms, both of them watching the warmly lit shop windows. As Leah crossed the intersection, the wind bit at her cheeks, but she felt something else just as sharp: certainty. She no longer felt like a passenger in her own story. Her life was steady now. She had a good man to share it with, through both the highs and the hard moments. Her daughter was healthy and thriving, and she was happy. The end. What did you think of this story? Don't forget to leave a comment and share it with your friends. See you next time.